What may appear on the surface as anti-corruption mobilization is better understood as an elite-mediated political conflict shaped and constrained by the very actors who claim to represent it. Corruption remains structurally embedded within the system. On the one hand, institutions are beginning to pursue high-level officials, but on the other hand, the sheer number of cases involving senior government figures raises serious questions about the depth of corruption.
Welcome to Talk Eastern Europe. This week's deep dive is going to be focusing on Albania, and I am so excited to be joined by Gresa Hasa to help us understand some recent developments in the country that we've talked about before in our audio podcast during the news segments, but honestly, I have been struggling so much with how international media has been covering this. Gresa and I will get into this, I'm sure, but really happy to have an expert on with us who's not only an expert in Albania, but also in Southeastern Europe and the Western Balkans more generally. Gresa is a doctoral researcher at the Faculty of Law at the University of Graz in Austria. She's also affiliated with the APOG and also with the Center for the Study of Southeastern Europe at the University of Graz. So really the perfect person to help us understand these topics. And Gresa, first, let me just say welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me here.
So I think we should dive right into it. We haven't done a lengthy, deep dive episode on Albania in a long time. And a lot has happened in the last year since there were elections, parliamentary elections last May, if I'm not mistaken. And this was a huge, landslide victory for the ruling party, the Socialist Party, which is, of course, run by the current prime minister, Rama. And this was the fourth consecutive victory for the party. So naturally, this is a first for Albania, as I understand it. And naturally has meant that we're entering a kind of new phase for the country, but a lot has happened since then. So I don't know if you want to start with the elections, you want to give some more context over the last couple of months, what are some of the most important things? But really my first question is just to get all of us up to speed on what we need to know about Albanian politics so we can talk a bit about the current developments.
Yeah, well, in the most recent parliamentary elections, the Socialist Party secured just over 53% of the vote, which is more than 4 percentage points higher than in 2021. This has given the party a strong majority in parliament with 83 out of 140 deputies in total, meaning it can unilaterally amend key legislation, including the electoral code, the penal code, and parts of the justice reform framework. In practice, this represents a further consolidation of power in Albania and deepens concerns about state capture in a political system that is increasingly close to functioning as a dominant one-party system. At the same time, the opposition has weakened dramatically, and civic space has also shrunk. So, in a way, we can say that de facto, Albania has regressed to a one-party system. The Democratic Party of Albania has been in decline since its electoral defeat in 2013. That defeat was shaped not only by growing authoritarian tendencies at the time, but also by two major political crises during its time in government. So the first was the Grdec explosion in 2008, when an ammunition dismantling facility near Tirana exploded, killing dozens of people and injuring hundreds. The tragedy exposed alleged links between political power and private economic interests, with accusations connecting then Prime Minister Sali Berisha, who is the historic leader of the Democratic Party, members of his family and close associates to networks involved in the operation. And the second was the 2011 killing of 4 protesters during an opposition demonstration outside the Prime Minister's office in Tirana, when the Guard of the Republic opened fire on demonstrators carried out under the authority of the Prime Minister's office during Berisha's second term in power. So this crisis, along with repeated corruption scandals, have seriously damaged the Democratic Party's legitimacy and undermined its institutional coherence and moral authority. However, instead of the later undertaking structural reform, the party descended into internal schism and has since remained captive to Berisha's authoritarian leadership. As a result, Albania today faces a political landscape where the ruling Socialist Party controls almost all state institutions and political processes, while the Democratic Party tries to muddy the waters politically, but no longer represents a credible governing alternative. At the same time, civic space has narrowed, partly because several civic movements have transformed themselves into political parties. For example, as per last May's election, the Together movement, a left-wing party and the only representative of working class interests, entered parliament for the first time with around 1.5% of the vote, gaining a single seat. But this used to be a grassroots movement. So the moment that they turned into a party, a very major civic movement in the country, in a way disappeared. So because every protest that they organize now, it's organized, from the party. As per last May's elections, there were 2 other new political forces which emerged. and joined this electoral coalition, which was called Initiative Albania Becomes. One was the hashtag initiative, led by Endri Shabani, who is now Albania's ombudsman. And the other was the Albania Becomes party, led by lawyer and former civil society activist Adriatic Lapai. Both are generally positioned on the center-right. Together, however, they managed to secure only one seat in parliament. It's very interesting because during the campaign, this coalition pledged to reject Albania's closed list electoral system, a system where party leaders, rather than voters, effectively decide which candidates enter parliament. They symbolically placed fictitious names on the closed portion of their candidate lists and said that they would compete only through open list votes, which they framed as more democratic. However, the closed list was never actually withdrawn or invalidated, and in the end, this single parliamentary seat was allocated through the closed list to a relative of Adriatic Lapai, an outcome which was seen as illegitimate rather than, being allocated to Lapai or Shabani themselves, despite the fact that both had received individual votes. So there was like a very dramatic dispute between the two. So we are currently in a situation where the Democratic Party is trying various strategies to regain relevance, from attempting to co-opt the causes of other political movements to adopting increasingly far-right and sometimes Trump-style rhetoric and selectively invoking historical symbols. For example, during this opposition protest lately, they organized a protest on February 20. This was before the last protest, which was held around a week ago. And this happened during the anniversary of the 1991 toppling of Enver Hoxha's statue during the collapse of Albania's communist regime. So the protest ended with supporters setting fire on Hoxha's former residence, which today functions as an artistic venue. I mean, even though that there were people inside. So this is where the Democratic Party is. And then on the other hand, you have the situation where, after having lost voters' trust as per last elections, and especially after presenting himself as the embodiment of a new and ethically differentiated mode of political practice, Adriatic Lapai now appears to be using the anti-corruption protests less as a principled stance and more as an attempt at public rehabilitation. So we have Berisha on one side, we have Lapai, who's trying to regain political relevance, and I cannot say that there is a dispute between the two because Lapai's party is weak, is much smaller, doesn't have the organizational structure that the DP has since forever. But the DP is feeding off these initiatives that are starting from other political parties, like in this case from Lapai's party, and trying to co-opt it and also monopolize the corruption cause.
So I guess as I understand it, we've now had this consolidation of power around Edi Rama's party. I mean, even just by sheer factor, again, of having these consecutive victories. And now the opposition is in some kind of disarray. And now there's this jockeying, it seems, between all of the possible factions. And everyone has a bit their own agenda. So it's becoming quite a complicated situation. And now increasingly tense and violent with these protests. So maybe we should speak more about the protests you already mentioned, kind of what prompted them and what they're really about more in essence.
So since December 8th, demonstrators have been protesting outside the office of the Prime Minister in Tirana. They have been blocking the entrance to the building as part of the ongoing protest, which was triggered by corruption allegations against former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Energy and Infrastructure, Belinda Baluko. So the allegations emerged after Albania's Special Structure Against Corruption and Organized Crime, otherwise known as SPAK in Albania, launched an investigation into her tenure at the Ministry of Energy and Infrastructure. According to prosecutors, Baluko is suspected of manipulating public procurement procedures linked to major infrastructure contracts. In November 2025, SPAK formally questioned Baluko and imposed a travel ban restricting her from leaving the country, while the investigation continues as we speak. Although the judicial process is still ongoing, the case has had significant political repercussions because Baluko was widely seen as one of Edi Rama's closest allies and one of the most powerful figures within the government. More broadly, the case is part of a wider pattern that has emerged over the past several years, where a number of high-level officials, especially from Rama's political circle, have faced corruption allegations, investigations, or prison sentences. For example, we have the case of former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Arben Ahmetaj, who is currently under investigation and has been accused of involvement in several corruption schemes. He fled the country and is now living in Switzerland. Another prominent case is that of former Interior Minister Samir Tahiri, who was accused in connection with drug trafficking networks that operated during his time in office, but at the end he was merely convicted for abuse of power. Similarly, it's the former Minister of Health and Social Protection, Ilir Beyçay, who has faced corruption charges related to public procurement in the health sector. And more recently, this was just exactly 1 year ago, the current mayor of Tirana, Erion Veliaj, also a senior figure within the Socialist Party. And until about a year ago, he was also seen as the second in line after Edi Rama. He's currently behind bars and he's being investigated over allegations related to corruption and misuse of public office. So, taken together, these cases have contributed to a growing public perception that corruption remains deeply entrenched within Albania's political system, particularly at the highest levels of government. At the same time, the investigations led by SPAK have also created a somewhat paradoxical situation, because on the one hand, they demonstrate that Albania's relatively new anti-corruption institutions are beginning to pursue high-level officials, which was rarely the case in the past. Thus, there is this growing trust in these institutions. But on the other hand, the sheer number of cases involving senior government figures raises serious questions about the depth of corruption within the political establishment itself.
Right. I mean, maybe just to back up a moment, and maybe this is a silly question, but who are these protesters? Are these citizens? Are these civil servants, party members? I mean, I struggle a little bit, and I'm a bit biased. I cover the other parts of the Western Balkans, like Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, where we've seen these massive demonstrations, also about corruption, but about, specific, not cases against high-level officials per se, but, about these accidents that have happened as the result of corruption. And as I said at the beginning, there's been a lot of international media maybe suggesting this is a broader regional trend. And I guess I'm curious to hear you explain a bit more, like, how is this distinct? If it is distinct, can we read it as a regional trend? Or is this something else more in the establishment than on the ground as citizens?
Well, in contrast to countries like Serbia or Bosnia and Herzegovina, for that matter, where anti-government protests over the past year have emerged organically from grassroots mobilization, the protests in Albania lack that kind of social base. They did not grow out of a broad civic movement. Instead, they are largely driven by established political actors who are trying to reposition themselves within the existing power structure. As a result, what may appear on the surface as anti-government mobilization, anti-corruption mobilization is better understood as an elite-mediated political conflict shaped and constrained by the very actors who claim to represent it. What we are seeing, therefore, on the streets of Tirana is not really a classic people versus the regime scenario. It is much more a sort of confrontation between competing political elites. So in practice, it has largely become Sali Berisha protesting corruption in a system that he himself once controlled and from which he is currently excluded. And particularly striking is the fact that he himself was only recently released from house arrest on corruption charges. So the face of the anti-corruption protest in Albania is also, a person who is deeply affiliated and accused of corruption, and not just corruption. So, although the initial demonstrations were launched by the Albania Becomes Party, which is led by Adriatic Lapai, as I mentioned earlier, they were quickly overshadowed and effectively taken over by the Democratic Party, which monopolized the cause and reframed the protests around its own political agenda. So this takeover has further discouraged broader civic participation. Many citizens are skeptical of the Democratic Party's attempt to present itself as the main vehicle of anti-corruption protest, given its own political legacy and its history of institutional confrontation. Like, confrontation would be like a very cute word to use, but institutional violence institutional violence, I would
Right.
say, while in power.
Yes.
So as a result, a significant part of the public sees these mobilizations less as a genuine civic uprising and more as a struggle among political elites, which is one of the reasons why the protests have struggled to attract broad societal support.
Interesting. That's really helpful. So this is really an elite conflict in a sense. And it's a shame because, I mean, you already mentioned that for citizens, the issue of corruption is a major issue. We also know, of course, it's a major issue in the context of the EU process, which I know we want to speak a little bit more about too. But maybe before or as part of that, maybe we can talk about, in general, the fight against corruption, how you assess it. In Albania, you mentioned that we have SPAK, this specialized anti-corruption structure that has been really a first, I think, in the region, we could say, in actually going against really the highest echelons of political society. But I also know there's been a lot of backlash, as you just described, between parties, among elites, and really this kind of mudslinging that has gone back and forth about their work. Judges have been intimidated, I know, as well on the SPAC. So I don't know if you have any kind of response to all of this and how you would maybe characterize overall the fight against corruption, maybe democracy and rule of law more broadly in the country, either from citizen perspective or kind of expert perspective. How can we understand the broader trends?
Well, corruption remains structurally embedded within the system. I mean, of course, there have been some attempts to address it, particularly through the new anti-corruption institutions that you just mentioned. And SPAK has gained a lot of trust among citizens in Albania. Nevertheless, it remains a systemic issue, and perhaps more importantly, there is currently no political force that commands enough public trust to channel popular frustration into a coherent political alternative. As a result, even when corruption scandals emerge and generate public anger, that anger rarely translates into sustained, broad-based civic mobilization. It's important to know that Albania is a semi-authoritarian system and it functions like one. From one side, we have elections which are held regularly, but the political playing field is uneven and the process is neither free nor fair. And power is highly concentrated. Institutions and the majority of the media are captured, and political and economic elites are deeply intertwined. You don't know when one starts and the other ends. This situation, when you have such high level of concentration of power in the hands of one person, or let's say, one person and a few members around him, and you've had, like, especially in the last months and throughout the entire last year, constant attacks against judicial institutions. I mean, when Erion Velia, mayor of Tirana, was arrested, Rama even pushed the Socialist Party and members of the Socialist Party to initiate a protest against prosecutors and against SPAK, which was quite intimidating and which was quite problematic. I mean, they literally surrounded the building of SPAK, not allowing the prosecutors to leave. So this is where the situation is. And it's also interesting to know that recently, amid growing international pressure and increasing domestic criticism, Rama has dismissed 7 members of his cabinet, including Baluku. This was just 1 week ago.
Wow.
And this decision comes after months of public attacks, against SPAK and other judicial institutions, because Rama refuses to initiate parliamentary procedures to lift Baluku's immunity, so the prosecutors can arrest her and then they can continue with the prosecution. It's also interesting to know that this reshuffle is striking because it comes 6 months after the government was formed following the May 2025 elections. And it's a pattern which is not new. Since Rama first came to power in 2013, he has repeatedly reorganized his cabinet before the end of each governing term. So in practice, this has created a political environment where ministers operate in a constant state of replaceability. So their positions depend less on institutional responsibility and more on their loyalty to the leader. So in this sense, this cabinet reshuffles functions less as mechanisms of accountability and more as instruments of executive control. So this ministerial turnover has served as a way to individualize blame for political scandals, like corruption being just one of them, but while leaving the underlying decision-making structure of the executive untouched. So
Wow. Wow. This is really helpful for me and I think is very specific in a way to the Albanian context. Again, as somebody who focuses on other parts of the region, I do want to talk briefly about the EU process and what this could mean for that because, we've heard some very, very big promises from the Prime Minister. We've heard, different deadlines said it'll be just in a couple of years. I'm not even sure what the latest is. 2030 maybe is the latest progress, or maybe even it's moved up. But the point is, there's been a lot of focus on Albania and Montenegro as well being these kinds of front runners in the process. But what is your sense? I mean, on the one hand, I think about Croatia, who was the last to join the EU. You need it is, if we're being honest, you need a certain amount of executive consolidation and sort of consensus to move forward on these reforms. So I could see there being actually quite a bit of there's a machinery behind it now because of these promises and how much reputation has been staked on this. On the other hand, what you're describing under the surface is completely chaotic and, of course, fundamentally anti-democratic in a lot of ways. So I guess with all of this in mind, how do you see that prognosis of membership and the talks?
Yeah, I mean, from one side, it sounds a little bit paradoxical, because while Albania is like regressing democratically, at least on paper, it looks as if it's a success story and it's just moving forward. So here's the thing, like there is currently an accelerated process strongly encouraged by the European Union regarding Albania's accession negotiations. So this is prompted also because of the fact where we're standing politically as a continent at this moment in time with everything that's happening with Trump having taken office in the US and with all the conflicts that have emerged recently. Albania has reached an important formal milestone when it comes to opening all 6 clusters of the EU accession negotiations, with the final cluster opened in November 2025. So again, on paper, this positions Albania as one of the frontrunners for EU membership in the Western Balkans. However, opening negotiation clusters is significantly easier than actually closing them. So, well, Edi Rama has promised to complete the negotiations by 2027 and potentially achieve full membership by 2030. Well, the reality here is much more complicated. Progress on paper does not necessarily translate into substantive reforms. In practice, there is still limited political will to fully comply with EU conditionality, especially when it comes to rule of law reforms, institutional independence, and tackling systemic corruption. I mean, yes, of course, Rama is promising, EU membership, but at the same time, he's committed to fighting justice institutions and to not allowing justice to do its work. I mean, how do these two stand together? I personally don't know. So Rama, it's important to know that Rama increasingly fits the pattern of what scholars describe as a stabilitocrat, which is a term often used in the Western Balkans to describe leaders who present themselves to the EU as guarantors of stability while simultaneously consolidating power domestically and weakening democratic institutions. So in other words, leaders like Rama deliver this perceived stability and geopolitical loyalty to Brussels, but democracy at home becomes secondary. Albania under Rama increasingly reflects these specific models. So strong pro-EU rhetoric and rapid formal progress in the accession process on the one hand, but a gradual concentration of political power and weakening of democratic checks and balances on the other. So on the surface, Albania is a front runner, is amazing to see what makes it to the news often outside of Albania as well. In reality, the situation is way much more problematic. I mean, of course, we want EU integration of Albania, but we don't just want formal integration. We want structural integration as well. Like Europeanization has to go hand in hand with democratization processes at the same time. Without rule of law, which is the core of it, I don't see how this process can be beneficial both for Albania and the European Union and also for the region as such.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely agree. And I mean, we've been, I think, talking about the stable autocracy paradigm for so long, and yet it continues to march on. And I think as you were speaking, it reminded me also of the issues I've been mentioning with how then Albania is covered internationally. Because on the one hand, most headlines you will see, I'm sure if you pop into Google right now and search Albania news, is oh, front runner, this and this chapter being opened. But then every now and again, there are these like blips in the coverage where you get, oh, there were flares set off in Parliament and chairs burning in front of Parliament, but no explanation really fully as to why this is happening and how you can have these sort of two things hand in hand. And I'm sure there are so many criticisms we could yield against international coverage of the country, but maybe just as we wrap up, if there's any remarks you want to have on that, and just say either about the coverage, maybe some problematic elements that you've noticed, or just more generally what you think we miss, quote unquote, as outsiders, or we get wrong as outsiders about the country in this really critical time for its development, as you said, not just in regards to Europeanization, but really democratization as such.
Well, frankly speaking, what I often notice is at the very best, a kind of lazy journalism. And that has also been the case in the coverage of the latest so-called anti-corruption protests in Albania. The situation is not black and white. There are many underlying dynamics that tend to be overlooked. For example, it is often ignored that the main political figure leading these anti-corruption protests is Sali Berisha, who himself has faced serious accusations of corruption and involvement in political violence. He's even accused of murdering 4 peaceful protesters in 2011. It's also frequently overlooked that these protests do not appear to have broad public support. This creates a very false image of civic resistance in a context where civic space has shrunk and operates under many structural and political restrictions. On the other side, it's also very, very problematic of how Albania's leadership is portrayed abroad. I remember reading last summer a huge interview of Rama in the Süddeutsche Zeitung magazine, where, 2 pages of the magazine were dedicated to Rama being an artist and a cool basketball player. He's represented in many EU media as being this cool socialist leader with Adidas sneakers. And then the fact that he's a semi-authoritarian leader who oppresses dissent at home, who arrests activists, who bullies, it's not covered. And I find this very problematic, not only in regards of how objective journalism is supposed to work, but also in relation to the citizens of Albania and everyday people here who do not consent to this type of leadership, to this type of regime, and who still survive in a very decent manner that I highly, highly respect. It's not okay. I mean, if you're going to talk about the country, at least do it properly. Or often I see voices from civil society, like actual genuine voices, not being represented at all. And I see this cooptation also of the public space, internally and externally, by voices who are very close either to the regime or to these cartel parties like the Democratic Party of Albania or similar ones to it.
Wow. Well, I mean, as I said, a difficult time for the country, and completely agree, where ordinary citizens stand and the decency and just daily lives, that are being led in a sense in opposition as a kind of everyday resistance to this reality are really what deserve more attention. So hopefully we can put in our show notes some more information of different places that maybe those who don't speak Albanian can go and learn more about the history, the culture, everyday life, and also the politics, because we really lack, I think, some available expertise on this, which is why I am just so happy to have had you on, Gresa. I hope we'll be able to have you on again to unpack some of this, because it's going to be a wild couple of years, it sounds like, for the country and the region.
It looks like. Thank you very much.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Gresa. Until next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.